What happens when Hollywood's most intense actor publicly confronts a performer he considers beneath his level? In 1968, Kirk Douglas was dramatic royalty, powerful, uncompromising, legendary. But when he challenged Sammy Davis Jr. in front of industry elites, what followed was a whispered response that would haunt him for decades. This is the devastating story of how 5 quiet words changed a legend forever. September 1968. Kirk Douglas was experiencing one of the most successful periods of his legendary career. Spartacus had established his reputation as Hollywood's most intensely committed dramatic actor. Lust for Life had proven his artistic range, and his production company was revolutionizing how actors controlled their careers. At 51, Douglas embodied everything that traditional Hollywood considered authentic dramatic power: systematic character development, emotional intensity, and the kind of masculine authority that commanded respect from industry professionals and audiences alike. Kirk believed in the hierarchy of acting, recalled director Vincente Minnelli. He saw himself at the top of the dramatic food chain, serious actors who approached their craft with intellectual rigor and emotional honesty. Everyone else was just entertainment. This unwavering confidence in his artistic superiority would lead to one of the most humbling encounters in Hollywood history. The setting was a prestigious industry gathering at the Beverly Hills Hotel, where established dramatic actors were meeting with studio executives to discuss upcoming prestige projects. It was exactly the kind of event where artistic hierarchies could be demonstrated and traditional, dramatic values could be celebrated. Sammy Davis Jr. was there, representing the variety entertainment sector, exploring opportunities to expand into dramatic roles that would showcase his range beyond singing and dancing. But to Douglas, Sammy represented everything that threatened serious dramatic work, commercial entertainment designed for mass appeal rather than artistic integrity. Kirk made his feelings about song and dance men very clear, remembered actress Ann Baxter, who witnessed the confrontation. He believed serious acting required commitment to truth that entertainment performers simply couldn't understand or access. The tension escalated during a cocktail hour discussion about maintaining artistic standards in an increasingly commercial industry, when Douglas decided to establish clear boundaries about who belonged in serious dramatic conversations. The problem with performers like Sammy, Douglas announced to the assembled group, his voice carrying the gravelly intensity that had made him famous, is that they approach acting as an extension of entertainment rather than a commitment to truth. Real actors don't perform characters. They become them through systematic psychological work. It was a calculated dismissal designed to establish hierarchies of artistic legitimacy, positioning method actors and serious dramatic performers as authentic artists, while relegating variety entertainers to the category of skilled but ultimately superficial performers. The comment created immediate tension among the gathered industry professionals, who recognized that Douglas had just publicly challenged one of entertainment's most respected figures in front of Hollywood's most influential executives. Sammy looked up from his conversation with producer Arthur Freed, recognizing the deliberate provocation, but maintaining the composed dignity that had carried him through decades of far more serious challenges than professional condescension. "That's an interesting perspective on dramatic work, Kirk." Sammy replied with the kind of respectful attention that indicated he was taking the comment seriously rather than dismissing it as mere professional rivalry. The response caught Douglas off guard. He had expected either defensive justification or deferential acknowledgement of his superior dramatic credentials, not thoughtful engagement with his artistic philosophy. "It's not just a perspective," Douglas replied, his intensity increasing as he warmed to his favorite subject. "It's the fundamental distinction between authentic dramatic work and entertainment performance. Real acting requires accessing genuine emotional states through systematic psychological preparation." Sammy nodded thoughtfully, as if receiving valuable educational information about the difference between entertainment and serious dramatic artistry. "So you're saying that authentic acting requires internal emotional access rather than the ability to create convincing character portrayals?" Sammy asked with genuine curiosity. "Exactly," Douglas confirmed, pleased that his analysis was being properly understood. "Anyone can learn to mimic behavior or deliver lines convincingly, But real dramatic work means finding truth within yourself and applying it to character development. Most entertainers work from the outside in, but authentic actors work from the inside out. The explanation was delivered with the passion that characterized Douglas's approach to all discussions about his craft and artistic philosophy. "That's a sophisticated methodology," Sammy agreed. "Very comprehensive approach to character authenticity." He maintained his respectful demeanor while continuing. "Though I wonder if there might be different definitions of what finding truth within yourself actually means when it's applied to dramatic character work." Douglas's competitive instincts engaged immediately, sensing that this conversation was moving toward territory where he could demonstrate the superiority of serious dramatic training through direct comparison with entertainment technique. "There's only one definition that matters from an artistic standpoint," Douglas said, with the conviction of someone whose career success validated his theoretical approach. "Complete psychological honesty, accessed through systematic emotional preparation. That's what separates authentic dramatic work from surface entertainment." The assessment carried clear implications about Douglas's evaluation of Sammy's capabilities, that any dramatic work he might attempt would represent technical competence rather than authentic artistic expression. But instead of rising to the implicit challenge, Sammy did something that demonstrated exactly why he had earned respect from the entertainment industry's most demanding professionals for over 3 decades. "Kirk," Sammy said, his voice dropping to a level that required the surrounding conversation to quiet down, "could I speak with you privately for just a moment?" The request was made with such understated authority that Douglas found himself agreeing before he had time to consider whether private conversation was strategically wise. They stepped away from the main gathering, moving to a quieter corner of the reception area, where their conversation could proceed without the performance pressure that public confrontation created. "Kirk," Sammy began, his voice carrying the kind of calm directness that indicated he was about to address something more serious than professional rivalry. "I want you to know that I have tremendous respect for your dramatic work and your commitment to artistic integrity." Douglas was prepared for many possible responses, but sincere professional acknowledgement wasn't among them. "I also want you to know," Sammy continued, "that everything you said about the difference between entertainment and authentic dramatic work is absolutely correct from your perspective and experience." The acknowledgement was delivered with such obvious sincerity that Douglas began to wonder if he had misjudged the nature of this conversation entirely. "But there's something I need to share with you," Sammy said, "and I'm going to trust that your commitment to truth extends to understanding truths that might challenge your current framework." Douglas nodded, his professional curiosity now fully engaged despite his initial defensive posture. What happened next would become one of the most closely guarded conversations in Hollywood history, shared only with a handful of people Douglas trusted completely and not revealed publicly until after both men had died. Sammy looked directly into Douglas's eyes with the kind of steady attention that indicated he was about to reveal something significant and personal. "Kirk," Sammy said quietly, "everything you said about accessing genuine emotional states and finding truth within yourself, I've been doing that for 40 years, not through systematic methodology, but through necessity." Douglas started to respond, but Sammy continued with gentle firmness. "You want to know what real emotional preparation looks like? Try performing comedy and song while your father is dying backstage. Try dancing with a broken heart when the woman you love leaves you for someone who doesn't have to deal with the complications of loving a black performer. Try finding authentic joy to share with audiences when you've spent the day being told you can't eat in the same restaurant as your white colleagues." The words were delivered without anger or self-pity, just quiet statement of experiences that Douglas had never had to consider as part of his artistic development. "You talk about accessing genuine emotional states through systematic preparation," Sammy continued. "I've accessed every emotional state that exists through the simple necessity of surviving in an industry that has required me to maintain professional dignity while being systematically humiliated on a daily basis for 30 years. Douglas felt something shift in his understanding of what he was hearing. This wasn't defensive justification or competitive response. It was educational insight into forms of experience that existed outside his frame of reference entirely. "The systematic psychological work you're talking about," Sammy said, "is something I developed not for dramatic roles, but for basic professional survival. Every performance I've ever given has required the kind of internal emotional management that most actors only attempt in their most challenging dramatic roles. The explanation was revelatory for Douglas, who was beginning to understand that his systematic approach to accessing difficult emotional states represented luxury compared to the daily emotional navigation that Sammy's career had required. "And here's what I need you to understand," Sammy said, leaning closer and lowering his voice to barely above a whisper. "When you dismiss variety performers as entertainers who don't understand authentic dramatic work, you're not just wrong about our capabilities. You're revealing that you don't understand what authentic emotional survival actually requires." The words hit Douglas like a physical blow, not because they were delivered with anger, but because they carried the quiet authority of someone who had been forced to develop emotional capabilities that exceeded anything systematic training could provide. Douglas stood in complete silence for nearly 2 minutes, processing the implications of what he had just heard. Everything he understood about the relationship between systematic training and authentic emotional access had just encountered evidence that challenged his fundamental assumptions about who possessed genuine dramatic capabilities. "Sammy," Douglas finally said, his voice carrying a vulnerability that was completely uncharacteristic for Hollywood's most intensely confident dramatic actor, "I owe you an apology." "No, you don't," Sammy replied gently. "You were speaking from your experience and understanding. That's legitimate." "Yes, I do," Douglas insisted, and what followed was one of the most profound acknowledgments of misunderstanding in Hollywood history. "I built my entire understanding of authentic dramatic work on the assumption that systematic training represented the highest form of emotional access," Douglas said. "But what you've just described represents emotional capabilities that I've never had to develop because my life hasn't required them." Sammy listened with the patient attention he gave to all serious conversations about professional capability and artistic authenticity. "I've spent my career believing that the most challenging dramatic roles were the ones that required accessing difficult emotional states for a few hours during filming," Douglas continued. "But you've been accessing and managing those states as a basic requirement for professional functioning for 3 decades. The admission represented a fundamental shift in Douglas's understanding of what constituted authentic dramatic capability and where the most genuine emotional work was actually taking place in the entertainment industry. "I don't just owe you an apology for tonight," Douglas said finally. "I owe you respect that I should have given you 30 years ago, and acknowledgement that what you've achieved represents dramatic capabilities that exceed anything I've developed through systematic training." What followed was a conversation that lasted over an hour, during which Douglas learned more about authentic emotional work than he had gained through decades of systematic dramatic training and method acting study. The impact of that conversation would influence Douglas's approach to dramatic roles for the rest of his career, leading him toward characters that emphasized genuine emotional vulnerability rather than systematic intensity. "That night changed Kirk fundamentally," observed director John Frankenheimer, who worked with Douglas on several subsequent films. "His performances became more naturally powerful because he stopped trying to prove his emotional capabilities and started drawing from more authentic sources of feeling." Douglas never spoke publicly about the specific details of his conversation with Sammy, but industry insiders recognized that something significant had occurred when Douglas began privately acknowledging variety performers as legitimate artists whose emotional capabilities often exceeded those of traditional dramatic actors. Years later, when Douglas was asked about the most important lesson of his dramatic career, he would reference that evening at the Beverly Hills Hotel as the night he learned the difference between accessing emotional states through systematic training and managing them through life necessity. "Sammy taught me that real dramatic capability isn't about perfecting systematic methodology," Douglas explained during a rare interview in the 1980s. "It's about recognizing that the most authentic emotional work is often being done by people whose lives have required them to develop capabilities that formal training can't provide." The encounter influenced Douglas's selection of subsequent roles, leading him toward characters that emphasized emotional authenticity rather than systematic dramatic technique, and his performances became more naturally affecting because they drew from humility rather than professional confidence. The whispered conversation had lasted only minutes, But the respect it created would influence Douglas's understanding of authentic dramatic work for decades, proving that sometimes the most valuable education comes from having your professional certainties challenged by someone whose capabilities were developed through necessity rather than choice. Kirk Douglas had entered that conversation as Hollywood's most systematically trained dramatic actor, convinced that his methodology represented the pinnacle of authentic emotional access. He left understanding that authentic dramatic capability was often possessed by people whose lives had required them to develop emotional management skills that exceeded anything formal training could provide. The Beverly Hills Hotel encounter had begun with Douglas explaining why serious actors were superior to variety entertainers, and ended with Douglas understanding that the most serious emotional work was often being performed by people whose professional survival had demanded capabilities that systematic training could only approximate. The apology that followed would become legendary among the few people who knew its full context, not because it represented professional courtesy, but because it acknowledged a form of authentic dramatic capability that challenged fundamental assumptions about where genuine emotional artistry was actually developed and practiced in the entertainment industry.